I caught my nurse neighbor stealing my mail. She handed me her shift schedule and said, "Please." Declan Morris was standing at his workbench in the converted garage of Unit A, sanding down a custom cabinet door at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning when he heard the mail truck pull up to the curb outside, and he checked his watch because the postal carrier usually came closer to 9, but sometimes the route got rearranged without warning. 31 years old, running his own custom cabinetry business out of the attached garage of a subdivided Victorian house in Portland, Oregon, and he'd been up since 5 working on a kitchen remodel order that needed to be delivered by Friday. The house had been split into 2 units sometime in the 80s. Unit A, where Declan lived and worked, and Unit B on the other side of the shared wall. And they had separate entrances but a common front porch with 2 mailboxes mounted side by side. He usually grabbed his mail around lunchtime because mornings were his most productive hours for detailed work, but he'd been expecting a check from a client and wanted to grab it so he could deposit it later. So he set down his sandpaper. The rain was coming down in that persistent northwest drizzle that wasn't hard enough to need an umbrella, but soaked you through if you stood in it long enough, and the porch boards were slick and dark with moisture. Declan's mailbox was the one on the left marked with a metal letter A, and his neighbor's was on the right with a B, and he was reaching for his box when he heard the door to Unit B open behind him. He glanced over and saw his neighbor Audrey coming out in wrinkled hospital scrubs that looked like they'd been through a war, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun that was half falling out. And she had that specific exhausted look people get when they've been awake way too long, eyes bloodshot and slightly unfocused. Declan had lived in Unit A for 2 years, and Audrey had been in Unit B for about 18 months, and their interactions had been limited to polite nods and the occasional, "sorry about the noise," when his table saw ran late. But he knew she worked nights at the hospital because he'd see her leaving around 6 p.m. and coming home around 8 in the morning, looking progressively more destroyed as the week went on. What happened next made Declan stop mid-reach and just watch, because Audrey walked straight to his mailbox, the one clearly marked with an A, opened it without hesitation, and started pulling out the entire stack of envelopes inside and shoving them into her canvas tote bag. Not just 1 or 2 pieces that might have been missorted, she was taking everything. And from where Declan was standing, it looked like completely intentional mail theft happening in broad daylight on a Tuesday morning. He cleared his throat and Audrey's hand froze halfway to her bag, and she turned to look at him with an expression that was more exhausted confusion than guilty surprise. "Hey, usually the Postal Service frowns on people taking their neighbor's mail. Pretty sure that's a federal offense or something," Declan said, and he kept his tone light because he was genuinely trying to figure out if this was some kind of exhaustion-induced mistake or if his nurse neighbor had been stealing his mail for months and he'd just never caught her. Audrey looked down at the envelopes in her hand, then at the mailbox she just pulled them from, then back at Declan, and instead of apologizing or explaining, she just reached into her scrubs pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was starting to tear along the creases. She walked over and pressed the paper into Declan's hand without saying anything, and he unfolded it while she stood there swaying slightly like she was having trouble staying vertical. It was a shift schedule from Providence Portland Medical Center Emergency Department, and it was covered in yellow highlighter, marking Audrey's shifts, and Declan scanned the dates quickly doing the math. She was working 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 days a week for the next 3 weeks straight, 12-hour night shifts with only 2 days off per week, and someone had written in red pen at the top, "Understaffed, mandatory OT until further notice." "That's my schedule for the next 3 weeks. I'm working 5 overnight shifts per week because half our trauma team quit and went to travel nursing for better pay. And the mail carrier keeps putting my utility bills in your box because apparently the numbers A and B are too complicated," Audrey said, and her voice was flat with exhaustion. No inflection, just stating facts. "I was so tired I just accidentally grabbed your whole stack thinking I'd sort through it inside to find my electric bill. I wasn't trying to steal your mail. I'm just completely running on fumes right now." She gestured vaguely at the envelopes still in her hand, and then just held them out to Declan, like she didn't have the energy to put them back in the box herself. Declan took the mail and looked at her face, really looked, and saw someone who was operating in pure survival mode. and the shift schedule in his other hand explained exactly why. 5 12-hour night shifts per week meant she was working 60 hours minimum, and that was assuming she wasn't getting held over for emergencies. And the human body wasn't designed to function on that kind of schedule for 3 weeks straight. "The mail carrier's been mixing up our boxes?" Declan asked, and Audrey nodded and pulled a crumpled envelope from her tote bag that was clearly addressed to her, but had been in his mailbox, a statement from Portland General Electric with her unit number on it. "It's been happening for like 3 weeks. I keep meaning to call the post office and complain, but I work nights and sleep days and they're only open during hours I'm unconscious, so I've just been checking your box when I see mail that looks like mine," Audrey said, and she was leaning against the porch railing now, like standing unsupported was too much effort. "I know that's technically illegal, but honestly, I'm too tired to care right now. I just need my bills so I can pay them on my phone before I pass out." She said it without any humor, just exhausted honesty, and Declan felt something shift in how he was processing this situation. He looked down at the shift schedule again, at the solid blocks of yellow highlighting, showing 12-hour shifts starting at 7 p.m. And he thought about what it would be like to live your entire life inverted from normal human rhythms, while also dealing with medical emergencies and literal life or death decisions. "Okay, new plan. Just keep the mail situation. I'll check both boxes when I grab mine, and I'll put your stack on your welcome mat on the days you're sleeping. You do the same for me when you're awake. Saves you having to dig through my box looking for your stuff," Declan said, and Audrey's expression shifted slightly, like she was trying to figure out if he was being sarcastic or genuine. "You do that. Just sort my mail for me because the postal carrier can't read unit numbers?" Audrey asked, and there was this edge of disbelief in her voice, like people offering to help was such a foreign concept she couldn't process it. Declan shrugged and tucked her shift schedule in his pocket. "Yeah, it's like 30 seconds of extra time. Not exactly a huge burden. Plus it prevents you from accidentally committing federal crimes in your sleep-deprived state. Seems like a win for everyone." He said it casually, but he was already thinking about the logistics, checking the boxes twice a day and sorting anything with a B unit number onto her doormat. Simple enough. Audrey just stared at him for a long moment, and Declan could see her brain trying to work through whether this was some kind of trap or if he was actually just offering practical help with no strings attached. "Please," she said finally, and the word came out quieter than the rest of her sentences, almost like she was too tired to maintain the defensive wall she'd been operating behind. "Please just do the mail thing. I don't have the capacity to deal with one more logistical problem right now. I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is." She didn't wait for him to respond, just turned and walked back to her door, and Declan heard the lock click behind her, and then silence. He stood on the porch holding his mail and her electric bill and the shift schedule that showed a human being working themselves into the ground, and he looked at his own mailbox and then at hers, thinking about how such a small, stupid problem had been compounding her already overwhelming life. The rain kept falling, and Declan went back inside to his garage workshop. But instead of returning to the cabinet door he'd been sanding, he sat at his workbench and really looked at Audrey's schedule, doing the math on sleep deprivation and cognitive load and what it meant to function on 6 hours of sleep per day while making decisions about trauma patients. The schedule showed her working Tuesday through Saturday this week, then Sunday through Thursday next week, a rotating hell of 5 shift blocks with no consistent days off. And Declan thought about the last time he'd seen her looking anything other than exhausted and couldn't remember a single instance. He'd hear her leave for work around 6:30 p.m., the distinctive sound of her door closing and her car starting, and then she'd come home around 8 in the morning looking progressively more destroyed. And he'd just assumed that was normal for nurses without really thinking about what that schedule did to a person long term. He grabbed both stacks of mail and sorted through looking for anything with Unit B or Audrey's name on it, found 3 pieces that had been missorted into his box, and walked back outside to put them on her welcome mat like he'd promised. Her door had a plain black mat that said nothing, no cute saying or seasonal decoration, just utilitarian, and Declan set the mail down and weighted it with a small rock so it wouldn't blow away in the wind. When he checked the mailboxes the next morning, there was a sticky note on his stack that just said, "Thank you, A in handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone whose hands were shaking from exhaustion, and Declan added it to the collection of random notes he kept pinned above his workbench, and the mail sorting routine became part of his daily schedule without him really thinking about it. He'd grab both stacks, sort anything for Unit B onto Audrey's mat, and go back to his work. And sometimes he'd see her mail sitting there for 2 days before it disappeared, which told him exactly how much she was sleeping between shifts. The mail sorting routine became this quiet constant over the following weeks, and Declan found himself checking both boxes twice a day without really thinking about it, morning around 9 and afternoon around 4, and he'd sort anything with Audrey's name onto her doormat and go back to whatever cabinet order he was working on. What he started noticing during those mail drops was the sheer volume of takeout containers piling up in her recycling bin. Those black plastic boxes from the expensive healthy meal delivery services that charged like $18 for a salad. And he could see the financial math wasn't great for someone working hospital wages, even with mandatory overtime. Late October hit and Declan was batch cooking on a Sunday because that's what he did to avoid spending money eating out during his work weeks, and he had his slow cooker going with enough chili to feed probably 8 people, way more than he needed. And when he was portioning it into containers for his freezer, he grabbed one of his glass Tupperware containers and filled it with chili that was still warm. He walked outside and knocked on Audrey's door, and when she answered, looking half asleep in sweatpants, he held up the container. "Made too much chili, figured I'd offer before I freeze all of it. You want some?" Audrey blinked at him for a moment, processing, then stepped aside and gestured him toward her fridge. "Yeah, thank you. Just put it wherever there's space." Declan set the container on the middle shelf and headed back out. The next morning when he went out to check the mail, the Tupperware was back on his doormat, washed clean, and sitting inside it was a bag of expensive-looking coffee beans from that fancy roaster downtown that charged like $20 a bag. There was no note, just the coffee, and Declan took it as the quietest thank you he'd ever received and started using the beans the next morning, and they were significantly better than his usual grocery store brand. That became a pattern over the next month. Declan would make extra food and leave portions on Audrey's mat. She'd return the containers washed with small thank you items inside, coffee or fancy chocolate, or one time a book about furniture restoration she'd probably grabbed from the hospital gift shop. They never talked about it, never coordinated, it just happened organically. This wordless barter system where Declan's cabinetry hands that were good at making things were now also feeding his neighbor, who apparently survived on $18 salads and vending machine coffee. Mid-November, Declan was outside on the shared porch around 5 in the evening, finishing up a repair on one of the loose boards, and he had his drill and some wood screws and was reinforcing the step that had started to wobble when someone walked on it. The sun was already setting because daylight savings had ended and everything got dark by 5:30 now, and he was testing the stability of his repair when he heard Audrey's door open. She came out in her scrubs with her work bag over her shoulder, clearly heading to her car for the start of her night shift, and she stopped when she saw him working on the step. "You fixing the porch?" Audrey asked, and Declan looked up from where he was crouched testing the board with his weight. "Yeah, this step's been loose for like 6 months. Figured I'd tighten it down before someone twisted an ankle on it. Landlord's not gonna do it, so might as well." He said it casually, but he'd actually been thinking about Audrey specifically, how she came home exhausted and probably wasn't paying attention to where she stepped, and a loose board was an injury waiting to happen. Audrey sat down heavily on the stairs above where he was working, and she had that end-of-the-week exhaustion that came from too many consecutive shifts. "Do you ever take days off? I feel like every time I see you, you're either working in your garage or fixing something on this house," Audrey said, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice, not judgment, just observation. Declan finished the last screw and sat back on his heels, putting his drill in his tool bag. "Not really. I like fixing things. It's straightforward. You identify the problem, you apply the solution, the thing works again. There's a satisfaction in that." He said it simply because it was true, and Audrey was quiet for a long moment just looking at the repaired step, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter. "That must be nice," Audrey said, and the way she said it hit Declan harder than he expected. This exhausted longing from someone who spent 60 hours a week trying to fix people in an emergency room and probably never got to see the simple satisfaction of a problem solved. He looked up at her, and she was staring at the porch boards with this expression that was part exhaustion, part something deeper. And Declan realized that what she did for a living was the opposite of what he did. She was constantly fighting against chaos and trauma with no guarantee of good outcomes, while he got to sand a piece of wood until it was smooth and call it done. They sat there for another few minutes in silence, and then Audrey checked her watch and stood up carefully, testing the repaired step with her foot. Thanks for fixing this. And for the food, I know I haven't said it out loud, but the Tupperware thing has been keeping me from living entirely on vending machine garbage. She said it quickly, like she'd been holding it in, and finally decided to acknowledge what had been happening, and Declan just nodded. No problem. I make too much anyway. Easier to share than waste it. They left it at that, and Audrey headed to her car for her shift, and Declan packed up his tools and went inside, thinking about that must be nice comment and what it revealed about how she experienced her work. December came in with freezing rain and temperatures that dropped below 30 at night, and Declan was in his garage workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, working on a complicated drawer assembly, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered, and it was Audrey, and her voice had this edge of controlled panic that immediately put him on alert. Declan, I'm at work. I'm in the middle of my shift, and I just got a call from the neighbor below us saying there's water coming through their ceiling from my apartment. I think a pipe froze and burst or something. I can't leave. I've got 3 trauma patients. Can you? Is there any way you can check what's happening? Declan was already putting down his tools and grabbing his jacket. Yeah, I'm going over there now. Do you know where your water main shutoff is? There was a pause and the sound of hospital background noise, intercoms and beeping and voices, and Audrey came back sounding more stressed. I have no idea. I've never had to shut off water before. Oh God, if this floods the downstairs apartment, I'm going to owe thousands in damages. Declan was already out his door and standing in front of Audrey's unit, and he could see water running out from under her door into the shared porch. Definitely not a small leak. I need permission to enter your apartment to find the shutoff. This is a lot of water, and it needs to be stopped now before it gets worse, Declan said, and he heard Audrey take a shaky breath on the other end. Okay, yes, I give you permission. There's a spare key under the blue flower pot on the left side of my door. Please just stop the water. I can't deal with this right now. Declan found the key exactly where she said, unlocked her door, and stepped into an apartment that had about an inch of standing water covering the bathroom floor and spreading into the hallway. And he could hear water spraying from somewhere behind the bathroom wall. He waded through and found the main water shutoff valve in the hallway closet where the hot water heater was, cranked it closed, and the sound of spraying water stopped immediately. The damage was significant but not catastrophic, mostly contained to the bathroom and hallway. And Declan spent the next hour using every towel Audrey owned to soak up the standing water and opening windows to ventilate despite the cold so mold wouldn't set in. He called the landlord who said he'd send a plumber in the morning, and then Declan texted Audrey that the water was off and the immediate crisis was handled, and she responded, "Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'll deal with cleanup when I get home." When Audrey finally came home at 8:30 the next morning, Declan was sitting on the porch steps, and she looked at him with this expression that was part gratitude, part embarrassment. "You didn't have to stay. I could have handled the cleanup when I got off shift," Audrey said, and Declan stood up and handed her back her spare key. "The plumber's coming at 10. I already talked to the landlord. Damage is covered under building insurance since it was a pipe failure, not tenant negligence. You're good." Audrey took the key and just held it for a moment, and then she did something that clearly cost her pride. "Keep the key. I trust you. If my apartment ever tries to destroy itself again, I'd rather you get in than wait for maintenance to maybe show up in 3 days," Audrey said, and she held the key back out to Declan. He took it and put it on his own key ring, and something about that exchange felt significant, like she just handed him access to the one space where she was supposed to be able to let her guard down. "I'll only use it for emergencies. You've got my word on that," Declan said, and Audrey nodded and went inside, and Declan went back to his garage, thinking about how much trust it took for someone as fiercely independent as Audrey to hand over that key. 2 weeks before Christmas, bright orange notices got taped to both their doors. Mandatory HVAC and duct replacement starting Thursday morning. All tenants must move all furniture at least 3 feet away from every wall by 8 a.m. or service will be rescheduled and tenant will be charged the rescheduling fee. Declan read his notice and immediately thought about Audrey, and he texted her asking about her schedule. She responded 20 minutes later with a screenshot of her shifts. 3 consecutive nights Wednesday through Friday, which meant she'd have exactly 0 time or energy to move heavy furniture. He knocked on her door Wednesday evening before she left for work, and when she answered, she was already in her scrubs, holding her work bag. "Hey, did you see the HVAC notice? You need help moving furniture before they come tomorrow?" Declan asked. And he watched Audrey's face do this complicated thing where exhaustion and pride fought each other, and pride won. "I can handle my own apartment, Declan. I'm not a charity project for you to fix. I appreciate everything you've done, but I don't want to owe you anything. I'll move my stuff when I get home in the morning." Declan knew she was lying, knew there was no way she'd have the physical or mental capacity to move a bed frame and dresser and couch after a 12-hour trauma shift. But he also knew pushing the issue right now would just make her defensive. "All right, just offering," he said, and he stepped back and let her leave for work. He went back to his unit and sat at his workbench, staring at his phone. And finally, he just typed out a text message and sent it before he could overthink it. "I'm moving the furniture tomorrow anyway. Leave your door unlocked. You can be mad at me after you've slept." He saw the read receipt pop up about 20 minutes later, and then 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before her response came through. A single thumbs up emoji. Declan took that as tacit permission to do what needed to be done, because sometimes taking care of someone meant ignoring their pride and just showing up with the heavy lifting. Thursday morning came in gray and damp. One of those December days where the sun never really committed to rising and everything stayed locked in this cold twilight. And Audrey pulled into the driveway at 7:30 after what had objectively been one of the worst shifts of her career, 3 motor vehicle accidents in 6 hours, and a pediatric trauma that had required her to stay an extra 90 minutes doing compressions while the surgeon worked. She sat in her car with the engine off and her hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. And all she could think about was the orange notice taped to her door and the rescheduling fee she was about to get charged because there was no possible way she had the physical capacity to move furniture right now. Her body felt like it weighed about 300 pounds when she climbed out of the car, and the walk from the driveway to the shared porch steps was maybe 40 feet, but it felt like a mile, and she could feel actual tears starting in her eyes from pure exhaustion and the dread of having to spend the next 2 hours dragging her oak bed frame across carpet instead of sleeping. She made it up the porch steps, holding the railing like an elderly person, and she pulled out her keys with hands that were clumsy from fatigue, and she unlocked her door and pushed it open, and then stopped completely because her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Every piece of furniture in her apartment had been moved exactly 3 feet from the walls, her couch and her armchair and her bookshelf and her dresser, all positioned with what looked like measured precision, and her bed frame had been disassembled and leaned against the displaced couch with the mattress propped carefully beside it. Her fragile items, the lamp and the picture frames, and her collection of coffee mugs had been packed into cardboard boxes that were stacked neatly in the center of the room, and every single box had a sticky note on top in Declan's blocky handwriting. Kitchen, bathroom, fragile, books, everything labeled exactly where she'd need it when the HVAC work was done, and she had to put her life back together. Sitting in her armchair in the corner, holding a mug of what was probably cold coffee, was Declan, and he was fully asleep, his head tilted back against the chair, and his work boots still on. And there was a measuring tape on the floor next to him, and a level and some of those furniture sliders people use to move heavy things across the carpet without destroying their backs. Audrey just stood in her doorway, with her work bag still on her shoulder, trying to make her exhausted brain understand that this had actually happened, that Declan had spent his entire night moving her furniture with meticulous care while she was at work, and he'd clearly sat down to rest for a minute after finishing and passed out from exhaustion before he could leave. She dropped her bag and the sound made Declan jerk awake, and he blinked a few times, getting his bearings before his eyes focused on her, standing in the doorway. Audrey felt her defensive walls trying to go up, that instinct to protect herself from owing people, and the words came out sharper than she meant them to. I told you I didn't want to owe you anything, Declan. I said I could handle my own apartment. Her voice cracked halfway through because she was too tired to maintain the anger she was trying to feel, and Declan set down his coffee mug and stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders like his back was sore from lifting heavy furniture for hours. You don't owe me a dime, Audrey, Declan said, and his voice was completely calm, no defensiveness, just stating facts. You spend 60 hours a week keeping people alive in an emergency room. You make decisions that save lives while running on 4 hours of sleep. You don't get to come home and also have to be the strongest person in the room here, too. He gestured at the perfectly arranged furniture. Let me carry the heavy stuff for once. That's all this is. I'm not trying to fix you or rescue you. I'm just moving furniture so you don't get fined and so you can sleep instead of destroying your back trying to drag a bed frame by yourself. Audrey felt something in her break, that wall she'd been maintaining for years about not needing anyone, and she walked over to the displaced couch and just sat down heavily on the edge of it because her legs weren't going to hold her up anymore. She put her face in her hands and let out this long, shuddering breath that she felt like she'd been holding for months. And Declan didn't try to comfort her or tell her it was okay. He just stood there giving her space to fall apart if she needed to. I don't know how to let people help me. I've been doing everything alone for so long that accepting this feels like admitting I'm failing, Audrey said into her hands, and her voice was muffled and thick. You're not failing. You're just human. And humans aren't designed to work 60-hour weeks while also managing every single aspect of their life in perfect isolation, Declan said, and he sat down on the couch next to her, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel he was there. I moved some furniture, that's it. I didn't cure cancer or save the world. I just did something I'm good at, so you didn't have to, and you can return the favor by not working yourself into the ground. That seems like a fair trade to me. Audrey lifted her head and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that morning, and she could see sawdust in his hair and a coffee stain on his shirt and the exhaustion around his eyes that meant he'd probably been up all night doing this. You stayed here the whole time. You didn't just move everything and leave. You waited to make sure I knew it was done, Audrey said. And it wasn't a question, just realization. Declan nodded and picked up the measuring tape from the floor. Yeah, I figured you'd come home and see it and think maybe the landlord sent someone. I wanted you to know it was me, so you didn't have questions. They sat there for a while in the quiet of her rearranged apartment, and Audrey finally reached over and took the coffee mug from where Declan had set it down. And she took a sip even though it was cold and terrible. Thank you, she said finally, and it came out quieter than she meant but completely sincere. Thank you for ignoring my pride and doing this anyway. I would have hurt myself trying to move that bed frame alone, and we both know it. Declan stood up and stretched, his back making a small popping sound that suggested he'd been sitting in that chair for too long. HVAC crew's supposed to be here at 8. I left instructions on your counter about where everything goes when they're done, and I can help you move it all back this weekend if you want. Audrey stood up on shaky legs and followed him toward her door, and she was trying to find words for what she wanted to say because there was this feeling building in her chest that was bigger than gratitude. Declan, wait. Can I ask you something? He turned back and she was picking at the edge of her scrubs, trying to articulate what had been building for months. Why do you keep doing this? The mail and the food and now this. Why do you keep showing up when I keep pushing you away? Her voice was small and she hated how vulnerable it sounded, but she needed to know. Declan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was honest in a way that made Audrey's chest hurt. Because I know what it looks like when someone's drowning and pretending they're fine, and I figured if nobody else was going to throw you a rope, I might as well. Plus, I like you. You're smart and you work hard, and you deserve to have someone in your corner who's not expecting you to be invincible all the time. He said it simply like it was obvious, and Audrey felt tears starting again, but for different reasons this time. I don't know how to do this, how to let someone be in my corner without feeling like I'm failing at independence. Declan stepped closer, and his voice was gentle. You know what happens when I try carrying a 12-foot cabinet panel by myself? I drop it, or I throw my back out, or I crack the wood trying to muscle it into place. Some jobs just need two people. That's not weakness. That's just how the work gets done. He grabbed his level and his measuring tape. Go to sleep, Audrey. The HVAC people can work around you. And when you wake up, this'll all be done. And you can decide if you want help putting it back or if you need to do that part yourself. I'm good either way. He left and Audrey stood in her perfectly rearranged apartment, feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet in a way that was terrifying and necessary at the same time. And she managed to shower and fall into her reassembled bed, and she slept through the HVAC installation without waking once. When she got up 12 hours later, her apartment smelled like new ductwork and paint, and there was a text from Declan asking if she needed help moving furniture back. And Audrey typed back, "Yes, please, I'll buy pizza," and felt like maybe accepting help was something she could learn. 3 months later in March, Audrey's car died in the hospital parking lot after a night shift, and instead of calling a tow truck, she called Declan. He picked her up at 8 in the morning, drove her home, and when she admitted she couldn't afford the $1,500 transmission repair on top of her student loans, he spent the next 2 weekends under her hood teaching her how to replace it themselves using salvage parts. She'd held the flashlight while he explained what each component did, and somewhere between the socket wrenches and the transmission fluid, she'd realized she trusted him with more than just her mail and her spare key. 6 months later in June, the shared wall between Unit A and Unit B stopped mattering entirely because Audrey was standing in Declan's kitchen, watching him carry a cardboard box of her books through his front door, and her coffee mug was already sitting on his counter next to his, and her shift schedule was stuck to his fridge under a magnet, so he'd know when she was working and when she'd be home. Moving in together had been a practical decision more than a romantic one. Her lease was up and Declan's unit was bigger and had the garage workshop attached, and they'd been spending most of their time in his space anyway, so it made financial sense. The shift from neighbors to partners had happened gradually, starting with that furniture moving weekend in December, where they'd spent 8 hours rearranging her apartment back to normal and eating pizza on her couch. And Audrey had admitted she didn't want him to leave when it was done. The car repair in March had cemented it. They'd started having dinner together on her nights off, and Declan had started timing his woodworking breaks to match when she'd come home from shifts. And somewhere between January and June, they'd stopped being two people living separate lives on opposite sides of a wall and started being two people building something together. Audrey set her empty coffee mug on Declan's kitchen counter, sliding her shift schedule under a magnet on his fridge where he'd see it and know which nights she'd be gone. They hadn't needed a grand cinematic rescue to fall in love. They didn't need a millionaire's bailout or a dramatic public gesture. Real love didn't announce itself in a crowded restaurant. It showed up on a welcome mat in a Tupperware container. It was built over sorted mail, sawdust, and the quiet realization that independence doesn't mean you have to move all the heavy furniture by yourself. Because sometimes the right person doesn't ask you to be strong. They just show up with calloused hands and ask where you want the couch. And Audrey finally understood that letting Declan carry the heavy stuff wasn't weakness. It was just smart load distribution, the kind of practical partnership that made survival feel less like a solo mission and more like something worth building together, one piece of carefully labeled furniture at a time.